I like to start by telling the story, true story, about when the Spanish were up in the high Andes in the middle of the 16th century, doing what they did up there, you know, enslaving and exploiting and just being, you know, conquerors. And in the midst of all that, they started to run low on supplies, and they commissioned some of their party to go down, hit the mountains to the east and bring back supplies. Well, the parties didn't find any supplies, and in fact, they couldn't get back to Pizarro and his friends. And so they had to get out by going downstream, and they were the first Europeans ever to go into the Amazon basin. And among them was a monk by the name of Father Carvajal, who was the journalist for their voyage. He took notes. And he recorded in his notes of a great thriving civilization in the middle of the Amazon basin. And then the team got back to the Atlantic coast, and they went back to Spain, and no other Europeans came back to the Amazon basin for 150 years. When they got back, having read Father Carvajal's journal, they looked for these great thriving civilizations and didn't find anything. In fact, what they found was jungle and terrible soils, and there was absolutely no understanding of how you could sustain a civilization in that miserable environment. So they figured that Father Carvajal was, you know, maybe smoking something, and they forgot about it. And then recently, in the 1990s, another group of scientists went down to the same area, and they began to find that there were, in fact, very fertile patches of soil here and there across the Amazon basin. And that fertile soil was located in places where you would want to build cities, you know, at the junction of rivers and on plateaus and things like that. And this could explain, you know, Father Carvajal's observations. You know, it's certainly possible that the native people were wiped out by the European diseases in the 150 years after the Europeans came through. But they still had to explain these small patches of fertile soil right where the civilizations might have been. And they saw, you know, places like that might have had walls and ditches and other marks of civilization. So they dug into the ground, and what they found was that this black soil was laced with this charry material that is what we call biochar. And that where that charry material was, the soil was fantastically more fertile than just a few feet away. So they took it back to the lab and they did experiments, and they found out that, in fact, that biochar was the cause of making these soils so fertile. But there's another thing that comes out of this, is that that material had been in those soils for hundreds of years, and it hadn't broken down. And it was a way that the carbon from the Amazon trees had been sequestered or captured in the soil. And so with our current problem of global warming, there raises the question, you know, how can we not merely stop putting more carbon into the atmosphere, but in fact take some carbon out of the atmosphere so that we can reverse the damage that we've already done? And there are not that many good ideas on how to do that. And biochar is one. Biochar, if it was used conscientiously and worldwide to amend soils, has the potential to actually reverse global warming. And that's, you know, a big thing here. But, and make the soils fertile in the meantime. There's enough capacity in the Earth's soils to absorb all that biochar and return it to fertility. Now, biochar makes the soils fertile by a number of ways. Number one, it acts like a home for soil microbes. The microbes bury into the little spaces inside the biochar, and you'll see when we get finished making the biochar that it's very light, it's very you know, it has lots of air pockets. In fact, the stuff that we saw coming out of the biochar chimney was gases that are leaving vacancies behind them. And the little microbes, they bury in and they set up housekeeping Some people have called it a carbon condominium. It's very, very conducive to biological life. And they, you know, they live and they die, they excrete, they secrete, they are new generations. And so it's a fertilizer that doesn't have to be added all the time. Once it gets established, it stays established. It's called a living fertilizer. And that's why those soils in Brazil were so much more fertile. Even 400 years on, they were like 5 times as fertile as the soils nearby that didn't have that in. Another reason biochar helps soil fertility is that it is an alkaline material. It actually adjusts the pH of the soil, for those of you who know what that is, away from the acid. Most soils that are wet, like our soils, tend to get more acidic with time. This neutralizes some of that acidity and improves the health of the soils. It is also, if you use fertilizer, it holds onto the fertilizer and makes it available to the plants. It holds onto the, Greg's got some coming around. It holds onto the fertilizer, and so it doesn't continue right on through the root zone and go into the watershed and then go out into the Chesapeake or wherever. It holds onto that. It holds onto the water in the soil, so that you don't need as much, you know, the water stays in the soil, in the root area of the soil, so the plants can get it. And in fact, I saw an anecdote one time about some kids who did a little biochar experiment. And some of them used biochar and some didn't. And then they went on vacation and forgot to water everything. And the biochar stuff was still good, but the ones that didn't, because they ran out of water. So, holding things in the root zone. The other thing is the biochar. You've heard of activated charcoal. It's basically the same material. Activated charcoal has another processing step, but it's a very good filter. In fact, if you were ever lost in the woods and, you know, had to filter your own drinking water, you could make some biochar in your campfire and use that for your water filter. It is very good for grabbing all kinds of chemicals and nasties out of water. So there's a lot of things that biochar can do, and with all these things going for it, you'd say, well, why hasn't somebody commercialized this yet? And unfortunately, the answer is that the economies of scale with biochar are kind of upside down. It's very economical on a small scale, but if you try to move it from one place to another, you burn gasoline to move it. If you try to make it with electrical processing that burns coal or oil or something like that, you're going to lose the carbon wars. As it is, biochar is what's called carbon negative. It preserves more carbon than it puts back into the ecosystem. So biochar done on small scale is very efficient. Biochar done on a large scale, maybe not. Okay, so you caught me without my charts, and I might have missed something. But so let me ask if if you got what I said. Are there any questions?
Does it also hold on? So it does hold on to water.
It does hold on to water. It's very sponge-like. It's a hard sponge. They call it a carbon sponge. But yeah, holds on to water and anything that's in water.
Eventually, it will hold water.
Yes.
The first week or two, as long as it's still got it repels water for a little while. It's gotten in there. I don't know if it's a surface tension thing or if it's some other effect.
Yeah.
But it will repel this. If we poured water on this, the water would just run off.
Okay.
So there.
Or beat up on it.
There's, you know that oil and water don't mix, right?
Yeah.
They have a repulsive thing.
Yeah.
The same thing happens with biochar. It's kind of like an oil in that it has a surface that doesn't attract water, but it's also kind of like a sponge that has lots of pores that suck water in. So it does take some time for the biochar to absorb water. And if you put dry biochar in your plant next to your plants or something, it'll outcompete it for the water that's in the soil. So you really have to saturate it first. And it's a great thing if you can mix biochar with some compost or something, because again, biochar's biggest advantage is this living fertilizer. And mixing biochar with compost is inviting in all the microbes that are already there to come set up housekeeping in this carbon condominium, and so that you get that living fertilizer effect quickly. If you wait, if you don't do that, then you wait a couple years and the microbes will find themselves their way in. If you do it, the microbes will be there to start with.
Speed up the process.
Okay, did I miss anything?
Okay,
Any
one question.
Sure.
So can you explain more about why maybe on a mass level it won't work or maybe not work?
Okay, so the issue is, can we make biochar carbon negative? That is to say, can we not burn more fossil fuels to make it than we would, to be negative, because we're trying to take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Right, yeah.
And if you move it very far, you're burning gasoline. If you need electrical equipment to process it, you're burning presumably, power or something like that. So it's really right on the edge of being carbon negative, and it's only at the small scale that it is really nicely carbon negative.